In 1485, a man with almost no claim to the English throne stood in a muddy Welsh field, watching his stepfather's army march toward certain death. His name was Henry Tudor. Within 24 hours, he would be king. But before we reach that battlefield, before we see how a penniless exile gambled everything on one desperate charge, we need to go back to the moment a dynasty was born. Not in a castle, not on a throne, but in a forbidden love affair that nobody was supposed to know about. Catherine of Valois was a queen of England. She was the daughter of the French king. She had married Henry V, the conqueror of Agincourt, the most feared warrior king in all of Christendom. But Henry V died young. He was 35. Catherine was left a widow at 21 with an infant son who would become Henry VI. The English court, wary of her influence, passed a law making it illegal for a dowager queen to remarry without the king's permission. Catherine was expected to live quietly, to fade into the background. She did not. At some point in the early 1430s, she fell in love with a man named Owen Tudor. Owen was Welsh. He was not a nobleman. He was not a lord. He was a chamber servant, charming and fast-talking by all accounts. And somehow, in secret, Catherine of Valois married him. The marriage was kept hidden for years. Together, they had at least 4 children. Among them was a boy named Edmund Tudor. When the secret was discovered, Owen was arrested and imprisoned. Catherine was sent to a convent, where she died in 1437. But the children survived, and because their mother had been a queen of England, royal blood now ran in their veins. It was diluted, it was controversial, it was deeply questionable, but it was there. Edmund Tudor was raised as a half-brother to the reigning King Henry VI. He was given titles, he was given lands. He was married to a young noblewoman named Margaret Beaufort. Margaret was only 14 years old when Edmund died of plague in a Yorkist dungeon. She was pregnant, and the birth nearly killed her. It damaged her so severely that she would never have another child. The baby was a boy. His name was Henry Tudor, and he was the only hope his family had left. To understand why Henry Tudor's path to the throne was almost impossible, you need to understand the world he was born into. England in the 1450s was tearing itself apart. 2 branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, both claimed descent from King Edward III. Both believed they had the right to rule. When the violence finally came, it would be remembered as the Wars of the Roses. Red rose for Lancaster, white rose for York. On a single day in 1461, Palm Sunday, the 2 sides met outside the Yorkshire village of Towton. 50,000 men fought in a blinding snowstorm. 9,000 were slaughtered. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The Yorkists won. For the Lancastrians, it was a catastrophe. The 4-year-old Henry Tudor was now a dangerous prize. His lands were seized. He was torn from his mother and handed to a Yorkist nobleman to be raised at the castle of Raglan in South Wales. When Henry was 14, his last protectors were killed. He was smuggled across the Channel to Brittany, where he would spend the next 14 years in exile. 14 years. No army, no money, no lands, no powerful family behind him. A diplomat named Philippe de Comines met him during these years and left a devastating assessment. Henry was penniless, Comines wrote. His claim to the throne was non-existent, whatever one might say about it. Henry's reputation depended not on his lineage, but entirely on his own person and honesty. And Henry himself seemed to know it. He described his life as nothing but suffering, evasion, and prison. This was not a man who expected to be king. This was a man resigned to his fate. But as his small fleet set sail from the French port of Honfleur, Henry knew he was at last taking his fate into his own hands. Even defeat was better than the alternative. the slow death of endless fugitive begging around the courts of Europe. On the afternoon of Sunday, the 7th of August, 1485, 7 ships appeared off the westernmost tip of Wales. They dropped anchor in Milford Haven. Soldiers came ashore, a motley collection of 2,000 political dissidents and French mercenaries. From one boat, a thin man in his late 20s waded through the surf. He sank to his knees and kissed the Pembrokeshire sand. Henry Tudor had returned. He had no guarantee of support. The reigning king, Richard III, had called him the bastard Tudor and put a price on his head. But Richard had made enemies. He had seized the throne from his own nephew. He had locked 2 young princes in the Tower of London. They were never seen again. The rumor that Richard had murdered them was everywhere, and many powerful men in England could not stomach it. Henry marched through Wales into the English Midlands. Along the way, he waited for the support of his stepfather, Lord Stanley, the husband of his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Stanley was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, but he was also an accomplished political trimmer. He shadowed Henry's march with his vast army. He gave fair words, but no commitment. He was watching, waiting to see which way the battle went. Early on the morning of the 22nd of August, the 2 sides met at a place that would be remembered as Bosworth Field. Henry's forces were outnumbered. Richard had the high ground. Henry's vanguard marched straight at the king's position. Richard's artillery erupted. The armies crashed together. Then Richard saw a gap. He gathered his cavalry and launched a desperate charge, thundering directly into Henry's household troops. The 2 men fought face to face. The heavy painted battle standards pitched and swayed against one another. Henry's standard-bearer had his legs hacked from beneath him. It was the closest moment. Then the Stanleys charged. Sir William Stanley slammed into Richard's flank with thousands of fresh troops. Richard was swept away. He was battered to death so viciously that his helmet was driven into his skull. "This day," soldiers heard him shout, "I will die as a king or win." He died as a king. By mid-morning, it was over. Soldiers stripped the dead and dying of their valuables. Richard's body was slung across a horse, his hair tied beneath his chin, and paraded to Leicester for public display, naked except for a piece of cheap black cloth, like a dog in a ditch, some said. On a nearby hill, Lord Stanley picked up Richard's golden circlet from where it had fallen under a thorn bush. He placed it on his stepson's head. Henry Tudor was now Henry VII, King of England. Henry had won the crown. Now he had to keep it. This was the harder part. Because Henry VII was a king who had almost no right to be king. His claim ran through his mother, a descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. But the Beaufort line had been born illegitimate. Even after they were legitimized, an Act of Parliament had specifically barred them from the throne. Everyone knew this. Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the Yorkist king Edward IV, to unite the 2 houses. He created a new symbol, a rose that was both red and white. But symbols are not the same as loyalty. And Henry was, to quote his first biographer, infinitely suspicious. He was right to be. His times were full of secret conspiracies and troubles. Perhaps the most telling verdict is that of Shakespeare, who left Henry VII out of his history plays entirely, not for want of material, but because the reign was simply too uncomfortable to deal with. At his coronation, his mother, Margaret Beaufort, wept marvelously. Her tears suggested not joy, but apprehension. Pretenders tormented him. First, a boy trained to impersonate the Earl of Warwick, the last surviving Plantagenet prince. A Yorkist army of German mercenaries invaded England. Henry crushed them at the Battle of Stoke Field. Then came Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the 2 princes from the Tower. For nearly a decade, Warbeck was backed by foreign courts and by Margaret of Burgundy, who hated everything about the Tudor settlement. Henry eventually captured and executed him. He also executed the real Earl of Warwick, just to be safe. But the fear never left him. As the years passed, Henry became darker. His reign degenerated into something that looked, to many, like extortion and terror. He built a network of informers and spies. He used the law as a weapon, squeezing money through fines, bonds, and legal traps. An atmosphere of fear radiated from the royal court into the streets of London and throughout England. His two most hated enforcers, Empson and Dudley, became symbols of everything the country despised about his rule. He amassed an extraordinary fortune, something in excess of £1.25 million, the equivalent of nearly 400 million today. But money could not buy him love. And love was something Henry VII never inspired. In April 1509, Henry VII died at Richmond Palace. He was 52. His body was taken in a black chariot to St. Paul's Cathedral, attended by 1,400 mourners and 700 torch-bearers. But few, if any, grieved. The fact of his death had been kept secret for 2 days, so that the realm would not tremble. On the 24th of June 1509, Midsummer Day, a 17-year-old boy was crowned King of England. He was over 6 feet tall. He had red gold hair, a booming voice, and a physique that contemporaries compared to a Greek god. It was written that, when he moves, the ground shakes under him. He could wrestle any nobleman to the ground. He could compose masses and play the lute. He could debate theology in Latin with the finest scholars in Europe. He was a warrior. He had read Malory and knew that a good king was a brave and aggressive king. You had to strike down your opponent. You must not hesitate. It was a question of honor. His name was Henry. And from the moment he took the crown, people treated his arrival as divine deliverance. Court poets called him the Golden Age. Thomas More described him as the glory of the era. His father had been the winter. He was the spring. He had married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, who had originally come to England to wed his older brother Arthur. Arthur died after only 6 months. Catherine endured 7 years of poverty and neglect under Henry's suspicious father. Now, at last, she was queen. And for nearly 20 years the marriage worked. Catherine was intelligent, dignified, and popular. But she could not give Henry the one thing he needed most: a son. Catherine suffered pregnancy after pregnancy, stillbirths, miscarriages, infants who lived for days and then died. One boy, born on New Year's Day 1511, survived for 2 months. Henry celebrated with 3 days of jousting. Then the baby died. Only one child survived, a girl named Mary. In the 16th century, a female heir was considered a catastrophe. Henry needed a son. Without one, the dynasty, barely 1 generation old, would collapse. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was approaching 40. Her beauty had faded. The young King of France described her as ugly and deformed. Henry stopped visiting her bed. And then he fell in love. Anne Boleyn was not the most beautiful woman at court, but she was sharp-witted, politically savvy, and she refused to become the king's mistress. Other women had agreed to that arrangement. Anne did not. She wanted to be queen. Henry began to convince himself that God was punishing him. He had read the verse in Leviticus, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife." Catherine had been his brother's wife. Perhaps the marriage had been cursed from the beginning. Perhaps that was why all his sons had died. In 1527, he asked the Pope to annul his marriage. What followed was 6 years of diplomatic chaos. Pope Clement was a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine's nephew. The Pope could not annul the marriage without enraging the most powerful man in Europe. So the Pope did what the Pope does best. He delayed. Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful churchman in England, the man who had run the kingdom for 2 decades, was sent to fix the problem. He failed. In 1529, Wolsey fell from power and died on his way to face treason charges. Henry replaced him with Thomas Cromwell, a merchant, moneylender, and lawyer of ruthless intelligence. And Cromwell offered Henry a solution no one else had dared to suggest. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, then England would leave the Pope. Between 1532 and 1534, Henry and Cromwell dismantled 1,000 years of Christian obedience. The Act of Supremacy declared the king, not the Pope, to be the supreme head of the Church of England. Henry married Anne Boleyn in January 1533. She was already pregnant. But the child was a girl, Elizabeth. Not the son Henry had destroyed his marriage and his relationship with half of Europe to produce. A girl. The consequences of the break with Rome accelerated. Thomas More, the brilliant lawyer, the author of Utopia, once Henry's closest companion, refused to acknowledge the king's supremacy. He was beheaded on Tower Hill. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, was executed the same year. The Carthusian monks who refused to sign the oath were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Then Cromwell turned to the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, some 800 monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries were dissolved. Their lands were seized. Their treasures were confiscated. 26 carts were needed to carry away the wealth from the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury alone. Monks and nuns were pensioned off or thrown out. Libraries were burned. Centuries of learning and devotion were erased in a matter of months. In the autumn of 1536, tens of thousands marched in the north under a banner showing the 5 wounds of Christ. They called it the Pilgrimage of Grace. They demanded the restoration of the monasteries and the removal of Cromwell. Henry crushed them. He promised pardons, then broke his promises. Over 200 were executed. The wrath of the king meant death. Anne Boleyn lasted 3 years. She failed to produce a male heir. She miscarried a son in January 1536. By spring, she was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. 5 men were accused alongside her, including her own brother. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. On the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded in the Tower. She had been queen for 1,000 days. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. And in October 1537, Jane gave Henry what he had wanted for 28 years. A son, Edward. The kingdom erupted. Bonfires blazed. Church bells rang through the night. 2,000 rounds were fired from the Tower's cannons. 12 days later, Jane died of postnatal complications. Of all his wives, she was the one he loved most genuinely. She was the only one he asked to be buried beside. After Jane came 3 more marriages. Anne of Cleves, a political match arranged by Cromwell. Henry found her physically repulsive, and the marriage was annulled within 6 months. Cromwell paid for the disaster with his head. Catherine Howard, a teenage girl, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, pretty, flirtatious, and fatally careless. When evidence of her affairs reached the king, she was beheaded on Tower Green. She was probably 19. Catherine Parr, the last wife. Intelligent, scholarly, twice widowed. When the conservative faction tried to have her arrested for heresy, she threw herself at the king's feet and told him she had only ever discussed theology to learn from his vast wisdom. "And is it even so, sweetheart?" he said. His vanity appeased, he forgave her. By this time, Henry was barely recognizable as the Golden Prince who had taken the throne 35 years earlier. He was obese. He had ulcerated legs that would not heal and had to be transported through his own palaces in a wheeled chair. He needed a mechanical hoist to climb stairs. He wore spectacles clipped to his nose. He was in almost constant pain, and pain made him dangerous. In the final years, his privy chamber became a place of whispered conspiracies, where factions competed and everyone understood that a single wrong word could mean death. He had executed 2 wives and 2 of the greatest intellects in England. He had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and spent his father's fortune on wars that achieved nothing. But he had produced, at the cost of all this destruction, 3 children: Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. The future of the dynasty rested entirely on them. On the 28th of January 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall. He was 55. The heralds announced it in the old Norman French. Le noble roi Henri le VIII est mort. Then with one voice they cried, Vive le noble roi Édouard le VIe. The boy was 9 years old. Edward VI was everything a prince was supposed to be. He was precocious. He read Cicero in Latin and Herodotus in Greek. He studied geography and history to prepare himself for rule. His caps were studded with diamonds and sapphires. His garments were woven from cloth of gold. He possessed a dagger of gold that hung from a rope of pearls. He shone as he walked. And he was 9 years old. England was governed by a regency council dominated by his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, a committed Protestant. Under his leadership, the Reformation accelerated. The Mass was abolished. Churches were stripped of their remaining statues, images, and ornaments. The Book of Common Prayer, in English, was imposed on every parish. For millions, the religion they had known their entire lives was being torn away. The candles, the incense, the saints' days, the Latin hymns, all of it vanishing. In 1549, the country erupted. Rebellions broke out in Devon, Cornwall, and Norfolk. All were crushed with extreme violence. Somerset fell. He was replaced by the Duke of Northumberland, a harder, more ruthless man. William Cecil, the brilliant administrator who would later dominate Elizabeth's reign, admitted the truth in a state paper. The majority of our people will be with our adversaries. The Reformation had been imposed from the top. Most of the population had not asked for it. Then, in February 1553, Edward contracted a cold that would not go away. By spring, he was coughing up black, foul-smelling sputum. His body burned with fever. His belly was swollen. He could not sleep without opium. An Italian physician recorded that the king carried himself like an old man. He was 15 years old, and he was dying. He was still capable of a Tudor outburst. When his will was obstructed, he exclaimed to his counselors, "You pluck out my feathers as if I were but a tame falcon. The day will come when I shall pluck out yours." The next in line was Mary, Henry's eldest daughter. Catholic, fiercely, immovably Catholic. If she became queen, she would undo everything the reformers had built. For Northumberland, this was unthinkable. So he and the dying king devised a plan. Mary and Elizabeth would be declared illegitimate. The crown would pass to Lady Jane Grey, a devout Protestant and, conveniently, Northumberland's daughter-in-law. Jane was learned beyond her years. When the scholar Roger Ascham visited her, he found her reading Plato while her family hunted in the park. He asked her why she was not with them. "I think all their sport in the park is but a shade," she replied, "to the pleasure I find in Plato." The judges declared the plan illegal. Edward overruled them. "Why is my will disobeyed? There must be no delay." On the 6th of July 1553, Edward died. He was 15. His last prayer, "Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life and take me among thy chosen." A storm broke over London. The sky went dark. Hail lay in the gardens as red as blood. It was said that the grave of Henry VIII had opened, and that the old king had risen in protest. Lady Jane Grey was told she was queen. She received the news with alarm. The crown could not be for her. But then she recovered. She raised her hands in prayer and asked God for grace to govern well. On the 10th of July, the heralds announced Queen Jane in the streets of London. The crowds responded with silence. Sorrowful and averted faces stared back. A vintner's boy named Gilbert Potter shouted that the Lady Mary has the better title. He was seized. His ears were cut off the next morning. Meanwhile, Mary fled to Norfolk. Supporters flocked to her. The Earl of Sussex, the Earl of Bath, 6 warships defected. The whole of East Anglia rose. Northumberland marched from London with 600 men. "The people press to see us," he remarked, "but not one saith God speed us." His army mutinied, his allies deserted. On the 19th of July, the councillors declared for Mary. The Earl of Pembroke drew his sword. "This blade shall make Mary queen, or I will lose my life." Not one voice spoke for Jane. Lady Jane Grey's reign had lasted 9 days. Her father rushed to her chamber and tore down the canopy of state above her head. It was over. Northumberland was executed on Tower Hill. At the scaffold, he renounced Protestantism and declared that he died in the Catholic faith. "I have deserved 1,000 deaths," he told the executioner. He made the sign of the cross in the sawdust and laid his head upon the block. One stroke of the axe was enough. Small children mopped up the blood that dripped through the slits of the scaffold. Mary Tudor entered London in triumph. Her horse was trapped in cloth of gold. Her gown of purple velvet was embroidered with jewels. She was 37. She had spent most of her life being humiliated, declared illegitimate by her own father, separated from her mother, pressured to abandon her faith. She had never broken. And now she was queen. She believed with absolute certainty that God had placed her on the throne. Her mission was to return England to the Catholic faith. She restored the Mass. She reconnected with Rome. She married Philip II of Spain, a man 11 years younger who did not love her. The marriage was deeply unpopular. Sir Thomas Wyatt led an armed rebellion that nearly reached London's gates. In the aftermath, Lady Jane Grey was beheaded. She was 16 years old. Then, in February 1555, the burnings began. Over 3.5 years, approximately 300 Protestants were burned alive. They were not, for the most part, powerful people. They were weavers and tailors, laborers and apprentices, housewives and tradesmen. Many of them were women. The burnings were carried out publicly, in market squares and open fields. The stench of burning flesh carried across entire towns. The most famous victims were the Oxford martyrs. Hugh Latimer said to his companion at the stake, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had written the Book of Common Prayer, died last. He had been broken by imprisonment and had signed multiple recantations. But at the stake, he thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed them, into the flames first. He held it there as the fire consumed him. And he did not pull it away. Mary never produced an heir. She believed she was pregnant twice. Both times the swelling was illness, not life. Philip left England and rarely returned. She wrote him anguished letters that went unanswered. She had lost Calais, England's last foothold on the continent. Her religious restoration was drowning in the blood of martyrs. On the 17th of November 1558, Mary died. She was 42. The name history gave her would endure for 500 years. Bloody Mary. The throne passed to the last surviving child of Henry VIII. A woman who had spent most of her life under suspicion, declared illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower. A woman who had survived by learning, earlier than anyone around her, that in Tudor England the only way to stay alive was to say nothing and trust no one. Her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was 25 when she became queen. She was tall, red-haired, sharp-tongued, and intensely intelligent. She spoke Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, Flemish, and some Welsh. Late in her reign, she delivered an extempore oration in Latin that left her court speechless. Her mother had been beheaded when she was 2 years and 8 months old. Her father had declared her illegitimate. She had grown up on the margins, always one misstep from the Tower. She had watched her sister burn 300 people, and she had survived all of it. Now she was queen. And the first question everyone asked was the one she would spend the rest of her life refusing to answer. Who will you marry? Elizabeth understood something her contemporaries did not. As long as she remained unmarried, she held the most powerful political card in Europe. Every Catholic king wanted her. Every Protestant prince needed her. She entertained proposals from Philip of Spain, from the Archduke of Austria, from the Duke of Anjou. She flirted with each one. She committed to none. Her counselors were frantic. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, her most trusted advisor, begged her to marry. Parliament petitioned her repeatedly. She answered with speeches that were masterpieces of evasion. I assure you all that though after my death you may have many stepdames, yet you shall never have a more natural mother than I mean to be unto you all. Marriage meant surrendering power. It meant placing herself under the authority of a husband, and it meant risking death in childbirth. Instead, she turned her virginity into a political weapon. She became the Virgin Queen. It was the greatest political performance in English history. But her refusal to marry created a problem that would haunt her for decades. Without an heir, the person with the strongest claim was her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart was Catholic, raised in France, widowed at 18. Her reign in Scotland was a disaster. She married Lord Darnley, a vain and unstable man who was murdered. She then married the Earl of Bothwell, the man believed to have organized the killing. The Scottish lords rose against her. She was forced to abdicate. She escaped. And then she made the worst decision of her life. She fled south, to England, to Elizabeth. Mary arrived in 1568. She never left. For 19 years, she was held under house arrest, moved from castle to castle, always watched, always writing letters, always plotting. She was the focus of every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth's life: the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot. Each proposed the same scheme: assassinate Elizabeth, place Mary on the throne, restore Catholicism. Each was intercepted by Elizabeth's spy network, run by the brilliant Francis Walsingham. Elizabeth resisted executing Mary for years. She knew what it meant to kill an anointed queen. But after the Babington plot, when Walsingham produced letters in which Mary explicitly endorsed Elizabeth's assassination, there was no more room for delay. Parliament demanded Mary's death. Elizabeth signed the death warrant, then tried to revoke it, then agonized for days. Twice she signed, and twice revoked it. She collapsed in pain. Burleigh and Leicester sat by her bedside for 3 nights. Eventually, she signed it a final time. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. 1 year later, the reckoning came. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch on earth, launched the largest naval invasion Europe had ever seen. 130 ships, 30,000 men, the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth rode to Tilbury on the Thames to address her troops. She wore a white gown and a silver breastplate, and she delivered the most famous speech of her life. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. The Armada was defeated, not by the English navy alone, but by a combination of English fireships, Spanish tactical errors, and catastrophic storms that drove the fleet onto the rocks of the Scottish and Irish coasts. Half the Spanish fleet was destroyed, thousands drowned. It was the defining moment of Elizabeth's reign, the moment when England, a small, relatively poor island kingdom, proved that it could stand against the greatest power in the world and survive. But victories do not last forever, and neither did Elizabeth. The last decade was marked by failed harvests, famine, and the visible decline of the Queen herself. 4 successive years of bad harvests drove the price of flour to triple. Real wages dropped lower than at any point since 1260. In Newcastle, 25 people died for want in the streets in a single autumn. The Earl of Essex, once her favorite, became her greatest headache. Brilliant, reckless, and convinced the court was conspiring against him. In 1598, during an argument in the royal closet, Elizabeth boxed his ears. Essex grabbed his sword hilt. The Lord Admiral rushed between them. "I would not have taken that blow from King Henry, her father," Essex shouted. He muttered something about a king in petticoats before storming out. She sent him to Ireland to crush a rebellion. He failed, made an unauthorized truce, then disobeyed her orders and rode back to London. He burst into her privy chamber at Nonsuch and found her newly up, her hair about her face, without her wig, without her makeup, without the mask she had spent a lifetime constructing. "By God's son, I am no queen," she told her godson. "That man is above me." On the 8th of February 1601, Essex gathered 300 supporters and rode through London calling on the citizens to rise. Nobody came. The streets were quiet. Elizabeth received the news calmly. She proposed going into the city herself, saying that not one of them would dare to meet a single glance of her eye. Essex surrendered that night. He was tried and beheaded in the courtyard of the Tower. "Executioner, strike home," he called out. It took 3 strokes. "Those who touch the scepters of princes," Elizabeth said, "deserve no pity." After Essex, Elizabeth withdrew. She grew thinner, more forgetful. Her eyesight weakened. She still danced the galliard at 68. She still rode every day, even in the rain or frost. Her ladies begged the Archbishop to intervene. He implored the Queen to stay indoors. She paid no attention. When a bishop congratulated her on reaching 63 and quoted scripture about the infirmities of old age, she told him he should have kept his arithmetic to himself. But the shadows were growing longer. Her longest-serving courtiers were dying around her. Burleigh, her spirit, died in 1598. She spoke of him in tears and turned aside when he was discoursed of, nay, even forbade his name to be mentioned in the council. Everyone knew the succession would pass to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth never said his name. She never formally acknowledged him. She kept her silence, as she had kept it on so many things for so many years. In the early spring of 1603, Sir Robert Carey came to visit her and found her in broken spirits. "No, Robin," she told him, "I am not well." She described her illness to him, a narrative punctuated with many sighs. For 4 days, she sat on cushions in her privy chamber, staring at the floor. She was by now unclean and emaciated. "I meditate," she said. Robert Cecil urged her to go to bed. Little man," she replied. "The word must is not to be used to princes." On the 3rd day, she put her finger in her mouth and rarely removed it. Eventually, she grew too weak to resist, and her doctors carried her to bed. The councillors asked if she accepted James of Scotland as her successor. She had lost the power of speech and merely made a gesture towards her head, which they interpreted as consent. On the 23rd of March, the Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned to her bedside. He prayed for half an hour and rose to leave. She gestured for him to continue. He prayed for another hour. Whenever he spoke of the joys of heaven, she squeezed his hand. She lost consciousness soon after. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, died in the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603. She was 69 years old. Her coronation ring, deeply embedded in the swollen flesh of her finger, had to be sawn off. As soon as he heard the sound of her women weeping, Sir Robert Carey took horse and galloped towards the Great North Road. He was on his way to Edinburgh. He would break the news to James VI that he was now King of England. Thomas Becket captured the strange whiplash of that day. Upon Thursday it was treason to cry, "God save King James of England," and upon Friday, high treason not to cry so. In the morning, no voices heard but murmurs and lamentation. At noon, nothing but shouts of gladness and triumph. The long rule of the Tudors had come to an end. 118 years. It began with a Welsh chamber servant who fell in love with a queen. It ended with a virgin queen who fell in love with no one. 5 monarchs, 2 religions, 6 wives, 300 martyrs, 1 Armada. And the map of England, its church, its government, its place in the world, had been redrawn so completely that nothing would ever look the same again. The Tudors did not simply rule England, they remade it. And when the last of them died, alone, in the early hours of a March morning, the country she left behind barely resembled the one her grandfather had conquered on a muddy field in 1485. That is the story of the Tudor dynasty, from beginning to end.